Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we uncover a chilling tale of loyalty, betrayal, and devastating revenge. This is the story of the last betrayal. A veteran, a father, and a man of honor, Harold Monroe dedicated his life to serving his country and raising his family. But when a shocking truth about his children was uncovered, Harold's world fell apart, leading to a night of unthinkable violence. This story will leave you questioning, how far can betrayal push a person? And when the truth comes to light, is vengeance ever justified? Stay with us as we unravel the heartbreaking and sinister story of Harold Monroe. In the heart of a quiet southern town, the Monroe family was the embodiment of respectability and tradition. Harold Monroe, a decorated U.S. Army veteran, was the cornerstone of the family. After serving multiple tours in Vietnam and Iraq, Harold had earned not only a chest full of medals, but also the admiration of his peers and neighbors. Known for his discipline, strength, and unwavering loyalty, Harold was a man who commanded respect simply by his presence. When Harold retired from the military, he returned home with a singular goal: to give his family the stability he had longed for during his years of service. He built their modest but beautiful home with his own hands, pouring every ounce of love and dedication into making it a sanctuary for his wife, Margaret, and their 4 children. Margaret Monroe was Harold's high school sweetheart and the glue that held the family together. Warm, nurturing, and deeply involved in the community, she was the kind of woman who could make anyone feel at home. Margaret was known for her homemade pies, her soft-spoken wisdom, and her unwavering support of Harold during his years in the service. Together, they were seen as the perfect couple, a symbol of resilience and unity. Their 4 children were Harold's pride and joy, each one embodying a piece of the legacy he had worked so hard to create. Michael Monroe, 48. The eldest son was a mirror image of Harold, steady, responsible, and hard-working. Michael had followed in his father's footsteps in many ways, becoming the family's unspoken second-in-command. He was the problem solver, the one Harold could count on for anything. Vanessa Monroe, 45. Vanessa was the nurturer of the family, much like her mother. A school teacher and a mother herself, she was the one who ensured family traditions were upheld, planning holidays, and keeping the siblings connected. Marcus Monroe, 42. The free-spirited middle child, Marcus was full of energy and ambition, though his life was a patchwork of ventures. He often came home to Harold for advice and encouragement, showing his respect for his father despite his independent streak. Leah Monroe, 38. The youngest Leah was Harold's baby girl and his closest confidant. Ambitious and headstrong, Leah had become an accomplished attorney, but she always made time for her father, sharing long conversations on the porch where Harold would offer his hard-earned wisdom. The Monroes were admired throughout their small town, not just for their close-knit bond, but for the values they represented. Harold, in particular, was seen as a mentor to younger men in the community, offering advice on everything from fixing cars to raising families. Margaret, meanwhile, was the heart of their church, organizing fundraisers and lending a helping hand to neighbors in need. Together they seemed unshakable, a family rooted in love, discipline, and shared values. But behind the smiles and the perfect family dinners lay a secret that had been buried for decades, and when it was unearthed, it would destroy everything Harold thought he knew about the family he had worked so hard to build. Harold Monroe's 75th birthday was a celebration of a life well lived. Family, friends, and neighbors gathered at the Monroe family home, filling the air with laughter, music, and the aroma of Margaret's famous apple pie. Harold sat in his usual spot on the porch, his grandchildren playing at his feet while his children reminisced about their childhood. It was a day full of love and joy, a testament to the life Harold had built through years of hard work and sacrifice. Among the gifts piled on the living room table was a small, neatly wrapped box that caught Harold's attention. It was from Leah, his youngest and closest child. Open it, Dad, Leah urged, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Harold smiled at her enthusiasm and carefully unwrapped the box, revealing a DNA testing kit. I thought it would be fun, Leah explained, grinning. You've always said we've got military grit in our blood. Let's find out where it comes from. The family laughed as Harold chuckled and shook his head. Girl, I already know where I come from right here, he said, gesturing to the home and family he'd spent decades building. Despite his initial reluctance, Harold decided to humor Leah. All right, he said with a smile. Let's see if we've got any Viking in us. That evening, after the guests had left and the house had grown quiet, Harold sat at the kitchen table, carefully reading the instructions for the DNA test. Swabbing his cheek and sealing the sample, he couldn't help but marvel at how far technology had come. In his youth, the idea of discovering one's ancestry through a simple test seemed like science fiction. Now, it was as easy as dropping an envelope into the mailbox. For Harold, the test was nothing more than a novelty, a light-hearted gesture from a daughter who adored him. He mailed it off the next morning and promptly forgot about it, returning to his usual routines of morning walks, church services, and quiet evenings on the porch. Weeks passed, and the unopened envelope with the test results sat on the kitchen counter, buried under grocery lists and church flyers. Harold hadn't been avoiding it. Life had simply kept him busy. But one quiet morning, as he sat with his coffee, he decided to open it. What he found inside would change everything. At first, he was intrigued. Irish and Scottish ancestry, just as he'd suspected. But as his eyes scanned further, his heart stopped. Under immediate family matches, his name was listed. But none of his children were there. Each of their names was marked with a glaring 0% genetic relationship. Harold's hands began to tremble as he reread the report, hoping he'd misunderstood. But there it was, clear as day. The children he had loved, raised, and sacrificed for were not biologically his. The words on the paper were cold and clinical, but they hit Harold like a bullet to the chest. A simple birthday gift, a gesture of curiosity, had shattered the foundation of his life. The day Harold decided to confront Margaret was eerily quiet. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the Monroe family home. Harold sat at the kitchen table, the DNA test results spread before him, his coffee untouched. He'd spent hours staring at the paper, willing it to change, but the harsh truth stared back at him, unyielding. When Margaret walked through the door that evening, humming softly, she froze at the sight of Harold sitting there, his shoulders rigid, his expression unreadable. She set her purse down cautiously, her brow furrowing. "Harold?" she asked, her voice tentative. "What's wrong?" "You tell me," Harold replied, his voice low but steady as he pushed the crumpled papers across the table toward her. Margaret picked them up, her eyes scanning the text. At first, her expression was one of confusion, but as the realization sank in, her face went pale. She dropped the paper as though it burned her and took a step back. "Harold," she began, her voice trembling, "this doesn't mean anything. These tests, they make mistakes all the time." "Don't lie to me, Margaret," Harold interrupted, his voice sharp. "I've given you 50 years. I've fought wars, built this home, raised those kids. And now this? Tell me the truth." Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the back of a chair for support. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she whispered. Harold's jaw tightened. "So it's true." Margaret crumbled under his piercing gaze, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You were gone so much, Harold," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You don't know how hard it was. Raising them, keeping everything together. I was lonely. It wasn't supposed to happen." "Lonely?" Harold spat, rising from his seat. "While I was out there risking my life for this family, you were betraying me? 4 children, Margaret. Not 1. 4. Margaret shook her head frantically. "It wasn't like that. Bobby, He was just there when I needed someone. It didn't mean anything." Harold's face darkened at the mention of Bobby Lane, his best friend and the man he had trusted with his life. "Didn't mean anything? He's been in my home, at my table, around my children, and you let him." "Harold, I'm sorry," Margaret sobbed. "I made a mistake, but it doesn't change the fact that you're their father." Harold let out a bitter laugh, his fists clenching at his sides. "Father? That's what you call this? A lifetime of lies, Margaret. A lifetime." Margaret reached out, her voice pleading. "Harold, please, we can get through this. We've built too much to throw it all away." But Harold stepped back, his face a mask of cold fury. "You threw it away, Margaret. The day you let him into your bed, you destroyed everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as Harold walked out of the kitchen, the DNA results still lying on the table like an accusation neither of them could escape. The Monroe family was never the same after Harold revealed the DNA results. The truth, once confined to a piece of paper, exploded into their lives like a grenade, leaving devastation in its wake. What had once been a tight-knit family, admired by neighbors and rooted in shared values, became fractured beyond repair. Harold began by telling his eldest son, Michael, first. "You're not my son," he said bluntly, shoving the paper into Michael's hands. Michael stared at the document, his face frozen in disbelief. "This doesn't matter," Michael said, his voice shaking. "I don't care what that paper says. You're my dad. You'll always be my dad." Harold's voice broke as he responded, "It matters to me, Michael. I built my life on lies. How can I even look at you, knowing you're not mine?" Michael stormed out of the house, leaving Harold alone with his rage and heartbreak. Vanessa, the family's peacemaker, tried to mediate when Harold revealed the truth to her and her siblings. "We can't let this destroy us," she pleaded, tears running down her cheeks. "Dad, you raised us. That's what counts. And Mom, she made mistakes, but she was just trying to survive." Her words fell on deaf ears. Harold's anger burned too brightly, and the pain of betrayal was too raw. Marcus, the free-spirited middle son, couldn't handle the confrontation. "I can't deal with this," he muttered before leaving the house. He avoided the family entirely in the days that followed, retreating into his own world. But Leah, Harold's youngest and his closest confidant, was hit the hardest. She had always idolized her father, clinging to his wisdom and strength. The revelation of Margaret's betrayal felt like a betrayal of her identity. She turned her anger on her mother, refusing to speak to Margaret. "How could you do this to him?" she screamed. "To us? You've ruined everything." The weight of Margaret's betrayal and Harold's anger left a black cloud over the family. But Harold wasn't finished. The cold logic of the DNA results wasn't enough for him. He needed answers. He became obsessed with uncovering the truth, rifling through old letters, photo albums, and Margaret's belongings. He questioned neighbors, pressed old friends for details, and pieced together the timeline of Margaret's affair with Bobby Lane. Margaret, consumed by guilt, begged Harold to let it go. "Please, Harold," she said one night. "I know I hurt you, but digging into the past won't fix this. It'll only make it worse." But Harold couldn't stop. The man who had spent a lifetime building a family and a legacy now spent his days tearing it apart, driven by an unrelenting need for justice or revenge. For the Monroe children, the fallout was devastating. The family they had known was gone, replaced by silence, tension, and grief. They had lost their father's unwavering trust, their mother's comforting presence, and their sense of who they were. The quiet house that had once been filled with laughter and love was now a battlefield of resentment, suspicion, and regret. Harold Monroe's obsession with uncovering the truth about Margaret's betrayal consumed him. Days turned into weeks, and the man who once took pride in his calm, disciplined demeanor now seemed like a shadow of himself. He spent hours piecing together the timeline of Margaret's affair with Bobby Lane, his former best friend. Bobby, a fellow veteran, had been more than a friend. He was practically family. He had celebrated holidays with the Monroes, offered support during Harold's deployments, and even played with Harold's children. The realization that Bobby had been in his home, smiling at him, all while betraying him in the worst way, was too much for Harold to bear. He couldn't shake the image of Bobby laughing behind his back, of Margaret allowing this man into their lives, knowing the truth. Harold's once steady hands now trembled as rage and humiliation boiled within him. One evening, Margaret approached him cautiously, her voice soft. "Harold, we need to move forward," she pleaded. "This isn't healthy, for you, for the kids, for any of us." Harold's response was icy. "Move forward? You destroyed this family, Margaret, and now you want me to just forget?" Margaret sighed, defeated. "Bobby's willing to talk, Harold. He wants to clear the air. Maybe it'll help." At that moment, Harold's mind was made up. If Bobby wanted to talk, then Harold would let him, on Harold's terms. The next evening, Bobby arrived at the Monroe home. Margaret had convinced him that sitting down with Harold could mend some of the damage. Bobby walked in, his demeanor calm but cautious. Harold was already waiting in the living room, seated in his favorite chair, his posture rigid. "Harold," Bobby began, his voice careful. "I'm sorry, for everything. I made mistakes, and I know I hurt you." Harold stared at him, unblinking. "You don't get to call it a mistake, Bobby. A mistake is forgetting to lock a door, not fathering another man's children." "Look," Bobby continued, his tone defensive. "It wasn't planned, it just happened. But it's been decades. Can't we move past this?" Harold stood slowly, his towering frame casting a shadow over Bobby. "Move past it?" he repeated, his voice shaking with anger. "You destroyed my life, Bobby. You stole my family. And you have the audacity to sit here and ask me to forgive you." Before Bobby could respond, Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol. Margaret, who had been standing in the doorway, gasped. "Harold, no!" she screamed, rushing forward. But Harold was no longer listening. His hands were steady now, his years of military training taking over. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said, his voice eerily calm. The gunshot rang out, echoing through the house. Bobby staggered back, collapsing onto the floor as blood pooled beneath him. Margaret screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Harold, stop!" "Please." Harold turned to her, his face filled with cold fury. "You brought this into our home," he said, his voice like ice. "You let this happen." Margaret backed away, shaking her head. "Harold, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But Harold raised the gun again. The second shot was deafening, silencing Margaret's cries. She fell beside Bobby, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Harold stood motionless, the gun heavy in his hand. The house was silent now, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The man who had spent his life protecting others had become something unrecognizable, consumed by betrayal and rage. When the police arrived at the Monroe home that night, the scene they found was one of chaos and bloodshed. Harold Monroe was sitting on the front porch, his expression calm but hollow, the pistol resting beside him. The soft glow of the porch light illuminated his blood-streaked hands as the officers approached. "I'm the one you're looking for," Harold said quietly, raising his hands in surrender. "They're inside." Inside the house, the officers discovered the bodies of Margaret Monroe and Bobby Lane. Margaret lay crumpled on the living room floor, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling, while Bobby's body was slumped near the sofa, the blood pooling beneath him. The quiet suburban home that had once been filled with laughter and family memories was now a crime scene. Harold was taken into custody without resistance, his silence unnerving to the officers. The man who had been a decorated veteran, a community leader, and a loving father, now sat in the back of a police car, his face devoid of emotion. The trial of Harold Monroe captivated the small southern town, splitting the community in two. Some saw Harold as a broken man, pushed to his limit by unimaginable betrayal. Others condemned him as a cold-blooded killer who had allowed his rage to consume him. In court, Harold remained stoic. He didn't deny the killings and offered no elaborate defense. When asked if he had anything to say, his response was chilling. "They destroyed my life. I had nothing left." The prosecution painted him as a man consumed by revenge, incapable of controlling his anger. The defense, however, argued that Harold was a victim of emotional torment, betrayed by the people he trusted most. After a brief trial, Harold was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He accepted the verdict without protest, as though he had already come to terms with his fate. For the Monroe children, the aftermath was devastating. In one night, they lost both their parents and their sense of identity. Michael, the eldest, blamed himself for not being able to hold the family together. "Dad was a rock for us," he told a reporter, "but even rocks can crack under enough pressure." Vanessa, the peacemaker, retreated from the spotlight, consumed by guilt and grief. She struggled to reconcile the loving parents she grew up with and the horrifying events that had unfolded. Marcus, ever the free spirit, distanced himself entirely, disappearing from the town and refusing to speak about what had happened. Leah, Harold's youngest and closest confidant, was perhaps the most affected. She visited her father in prison, seeking answers. "Why did you do it, Dad?" she asked through the glass of the visiting room. Harold's response was quiet but resolute. "You don't understand now, Leah," he said, "but one day you will. I had to do what I did." The community, once united in their admiration for the Monroes, became a town of whispers and divided loyalties. Some neighbors spoke of Harold with pity, calling him a good man who had been broken by betrayal. Others couldn't forgive the violence, labeling him a murderer who had tarnished his legacy. Harold's once pristine home became a painful reminder of what had been lost. The porch where he had spent quiet evenings with Leah sat empty, the swing swaying gently in the breeze. His medals and honors, once displayed proudly, now collected dust in a box. In the end, Harold Monroe's life became a cautionary tale. A story of how betrayal, no matter how deeply buried, can unravel even the strongest of lives. How far can betrayal push someone before they snap? Was Harold Monroe a victim of his circumstances, or did he let his rage consume him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.